There are still wild places where humans are no more than visitors, passers-by. These wild places are special. They bring us closer to nature and, in a way, back to another time. Though California is the most populous state in the U.S., much of its rugged central coast has defied development. Mountains plummet to the sea, and storm waves batter the coast. Even along this spectacular coastline, certain places seem to be magnets, attracting both wildlife and human visitors. Point Lobos, just south of the Monterey Peninsula and Carmel, is one of them. At Point Lobos, people have become a part of the landscape, and not a bad part either. We are tolerated and largely ignored by the local residents. And maybe that's the way it should be. The greatest meeting of land and sea in the world. It is a bold statement, but to landscape artist Francis McComas, Point Lobos was much more than just a place. From its protected coves to its storm-washed headlands and rocky promontories, there is something very special about this place. Birds seek the isolation of island rookeries. Anchored and wrapped by kelp fronds, sea otters sleep in the calm waters of coves. Harbor seals nurse their young on sandy shores. Below, tide pools swarm with life. Scouring the surface for food, gulls ride incoming waves, and above, pelicans ride the winds. Offshore, the barking of hundreds of sea lions inspired Spanish explorers to name this Punta de los Lobos Marinos, Point of the Sea Wolves. Here, the convoluted coastline of bluffs, coves, islands, and bays meet meadows and cypress groves. South of Point Lobos, the mountains of the Santa Lucia Range plunge into the Pacific along the Big Sur coast. To the north, the broad sandy arc of Monterey Bay lies at the edge of a deep submarine canyon that leads to the depths of the ocean. In between is the Monterey Peninsula, and just south of the Carmel River, a rocky outcrop of land, Point Lobos. Point Lobos State Reserve is protected, a vital part of the California State Park system. Though parks are for people, preservation comes first at Point Lobos. Beyond its natural beauty, what makes Point Lobos so unique is its diversity. Several very different habitats meet here, and life abounds. Offshore, the rich marine environment surrounding Point Lobos was designated as the first marine reserve in the nation in 1960 and a national marine sanctuary in the 1990s. The deep waters of the open sea come close to Point Lobos in the Carmel Submarine Canyon. This is the domain of deep-water pelagic fish and gray whales. The near-shore environment is especially rich in life. Marine mammals, such as sea lions and harbor seals, live off the wealth of life found here. In the relatively shallow underwater realm of the kelp forest, numerous small fish and invertebrates find shelter. Sea otters live much of their lives in and around kelp beds. The surf and intertidal zone is one of the most demanding environments of all. Only specially adapted organisms can survive a life in between the land and sea. A life tested by the brutal power of crashing waves. This habitat is stalked by numerous predators, both above and below the ever-changing waterline. On land, the low ground-hugging plants and dense shrubs of chaparral survive the onslaught of winds, salt spray, and desiccating sunlight. Moist, well-watered meadowlands are rare enclaves for the native grasses of the northern coastal prairie. The gnarled, weather-beaten limbs of Monterey cypress groves defy time and the elements. Among the rarest of trees, the isolated cypress groves are a living link with the past and are related to trees that lived at the dawn of the age of dinosaurs. Dominating much of the landscape are forests of Monterey pine, providing nesting spots for birds, shade for forest plants, food for mushrooms, and cover for deer. But people are also a part of the Point Lobos environment, and they have been for thousands of years. Native Americans, the Ohlone, ventured to Point Lobos to gather food. Abalone, mussel shells, and fire-blackened earth mark their campsites. Spanish ranchers, Chinese fishermen, and Portuguese whalers followed, all leaving their separate imprints on the land. By 1900, Whalers Cove was home to Japanese abalone fishermen. And across the cove, a large abalone cannery. Hollywood has left its own legacy. Point Lobos has been seen around the world as a backdrop for motion pictures, though little evidence of the elaborate sets now remains, except on film. The geology of this place is what sets the stage for Hollywood and for all that we see. The sheltering coves, the rocky headlands, and the earthquake faults that break the bedrock. In fact, this entire stretch of coastline is a small sliver of the Pacific Plate moving northwest. It is a journey that began millions of years ago and over 1,000 miles to the south in the subtropics. The oldest rocks at Point Lobos and this part of the California coast were formed over 100 million years ago when dinosaurs walked the earth. These rocks cooled far below the Earth's surface, possibly miles below when they were forming. Hot magma rising from its source deep below the crust never reached the surface and slowly cooled in its underground prison to become a hard granite-like rock known as granodiorite. Today, the fault-fractured bluffs and headlands of granodiorite still resist erosion. Though just a theory, All of this took place far to the south, around what would be today Baja California. Tens of millions of years ago, the great journey began. Slipping and sliding in giant bursts of energy, earthquakes fractured and fissured the land, and the Pacific Plate slowly headed north, carrying with it the rocks of Point Lobos. Somewhere on this journey, northward of over 1,000 miles, and through time, the land subsided once more, this time under the sea. Submarine landslides brought the wave-worn cobbles, pebbles, and sand to cover parts of the ancient rocks. Compressed by weight, they cemented together into yet another rock formation, the Carmelo conglomerate and sandstone. Eroded into deep wave-cut clefts, bays, and intriguing small-scale features, the Carmelo Formation is colorful and full of texture. As the Ice Age ended and the ice melted in the northern latitudes, the sea rose at Point Lobos several times. For at least two periods over the last 35,000 years, the sea levels remain fairly constant. Wave action bit into rocks and scoured the ancient shorelines, creating wave-cut benches. Today, these old shorelines, raised above sea level and called marine terraces, can be found at about 40 feet and at 125 feet above present sea level. And so, what we see today is only a snapshot in geologic time, only an instant in the ongoing process of erosion and earth building. But mostly, Point Lobos is an erosional landscape. Powerful winter storms moving across the North Pacific build giant waves that explode on rocky islands and headlands, such as the Pinnacle. And erosion does not stop at sea level. Offshore, near the Devil's Cauldron, shallow underwater rocks are revealed in the deep troughs between waves. Violent, boiling seas seethe with power, and currents rake the rocks. At Sea Lion Rocks, the calm waters of an autumn afternoon bear little resemblance to the fury of winter. Storm tides can bring injury and sometimes death to sea lions at the wrong place at the wrong time. In winter storms, even the normally protected waters of Whalers Cove can turn rough. The weak and cracked and jointed rocks at Moss Cove are easily eroded by winter storms. At Cypress Cove, erosion has widened the narrow canyon-like fissures that follow joint lines. In the ongoing conflict between land and sea, Point Lobos is at the front line. The underlying rocks and the forces of erosion combine to create the foundation for what we see at Point Lobos. But like most foundations, much is hidden, buried below the surface, and at Point Lobos, underwater. Just to the north of Point Lobos, the submarine Carmel Canyon descends to depths of thousands of feet. A tributary of the underwater canyon ends near Bluefish Cove. Far offshore, the depths of the Pacific harbor a mysterious, unseen, and mostly uncharted world. Deep-diving submersibles occasionally penetrate the darkness of this alien environment. Drifting with currents, bioluminescent jellyfish light up the darkness. large tentacled jellies thrive in nutrient-rich waters. The open sea is the domain of schools of mackerel and large pelagic sharks. Where the North American continent and the ocean meet is an underwater highway. The route was pioneered untold generations ago by gray whales. In their vast north and south migrations, they cruise coastal waters, often several miles offshore. If there is anything close to an underwater signpost for whales, Point Lobos is it. Point Lobos is one of the closest places that gray whales approach the mainland coast of California. Portuguese whalers realized this, and beginning in 1862, used Point Lobos as a shore-based whaling station. Rowing from Whalers Cove in 30-foot longboats, they harpooned whales and towed them back for processing at the try-works. Hot fires burning under large cast-iron kettles rendered strips of whale blubber into whale oil. Whaling in the 1800s decimated the whale populations and threatened several species with extinction. It wasn't until the 1880s and the introduction of the kerosene lamp and petroleum-based lubricants that the demand for whale oil diminished. Other than humans, most whales face only one real predator: orcas, killer whales. Killer whales are the largest member of the dolphin family. Highly intelligent, and at the very top of the food chain. Herring, salmon, seals, gray whales, and even giant humpback whales are among their prey. Ocean currents and prevailing winds create an upwelling of deep, cold, nutrient-rich water that supports an amazing web of life. In the nearshore marine habitat, the variety of species explodes. California sea lions are among the most visible of the marine mammals. Large, gregarious, and loud, their barking calls can easily be heard from sea lion rocks. They congregate on islands and rocks, places that have afforded sea lion colonies security in the past. In early summer, mature males leave Point Lobos and head south to breeding grounds in the Channel Islands off Southern California. Underwater, sea lions are agile, powerful, and fast swimmers, and able to outswim almost all of their prey. Porpoising like dolphins to escape water resistance, they have been clocked at speeds up to 35 miles per hour. On land, unlike many other marine mammals, sea lions are fairly mobile. Their flippers pivot and afford them enough maneuverability to climb high up on rocks, keeping them out of harm's way in the heavy surf of winter. No matter what season, dry, relatively flat real estate is valuable. Sea lions stake out and raucously defend their territory. On the rocks, size, aggressiveness, and the ability to bluff and bluster count. Though they have thick insulative fat layers, sea lions enjoy the warmth of a sunny day. They have voracious appetites, but with the wealth of food along the Central Coast, they have what could best be termed free time. Harbor seals are year-round residents at Point Lobos. In calm weather, they often drape the rocks in Moss Cove. Though just offshore, the rocks afford them security from predators. Mothers nurse their pups on the rocks, and the pups get to know their neighbors. With about 50% fat content in mother's milk, harbor seal pups gain weight quickly. Within 6 weeks, they are weaned and on their own. The pebble and sand beaches of Bluefish Cove offer the isolation they seek. Here, the high bluffs make it possible to observe the reclusive harbor seals without disturbing them. In courtship, the male alerts all other seals within earshot by rolling on his side and slapping the water with a flipper. The sound carries underwater, and to help ensure success, the male usually carries on the ritual near a beach where females are resting. Swimming on his side or inverted, the male displays his normally lighter colored underside to draw attention. Circling seals and frothing water signal the start of the next generation of harbor seals. Onshore, lumbering gracelessly up a beach, or warily dozing on rocks, harbor seals seem ill-suited to the land. But in the seal family, the harbor seals are among the most ideally adapted for life underwater. Their ungainly appearance on land is countered by their effortless grace below the waterline. Streamlining, from millions of years of evolution, has extended even to their lack of external earlobes. Insulating fat not only keeps harbor seals warm in 52-degree waters, it aids in buoyancy. Sleeping upright, bottling harbor seals, as the name implies, appear like the tops of bottles bobbing in gentle swells. Above the nearshore waters, brown pelicans are the long-range masters of the ocean air. Excellent eyesight allows them to spot schools of small fish. Lifted high over bluffs by onshore winds, they often descend to wave-top altitude and use the surface effect to glide silently on unseen air currents. Compressed air from the crashing breakers catapults them skyward for yet another free ride. To lessen air resistance, pelicans follow in the draft of the lead bird and conserve energy in perfect formation flight. Close to shore, kelp forests are one of the richest of all marine habitats and provide protection for harbor seals, sea otters, and hundreds of other animals. A form of kelp, commonly called feather boa, thrives in the surge of open waters. Literally, going with the flow, its trunk-like stipe stretches to absorb the constant tug from currents and surge. The giant kelp prefers protected waters and can grow up to 100 feet in length. Though really just a form of algae, the giant kelp is the largest of all marine plants. The life cycle of kelp is closely tied to the seasons. Supplied with nutrient-rich cold waters and sunlight, it grows rapidly in spring and summer. The surface of bays and coves can fill with dense floating mats of kelp fronds. Underwater, The kelp is a floating reef. Bathed in streaming light and camouflaging shadow, small fish find safety in the brown stipes and fronds. Shrimp and a variety of invertebrates feed in this rich habitat. As on land, autumn brings gradual disintegration. The pounding of winter storms takes its toll on kelp forests, sometimes pulling the entire kelp, including its holdfast, from underwater rocks. The kelp beds surrounding Point Lobos are essential nurseries for sea otters. No other marine mammal is more closely identified with or more dependent on the kelp forest. Until 1911, southern sea otters were hunted mercilessly for their fine, soft pelts. They were generally thought to be extinct until in the 1930s, a small remnant population of fewer than 50 otters was discovered on an isolated stretch of the Big Sur coast. Under the protection of law, it appears that southern sea otters are making a comeback. Members of the weasel family, sea otters are most closely related to the lithe and long-tailed river otters. Instead of blubber for insulation, sea otters rely on dense fur and a very high metabolism to keep warm. Grooming is vital. Mothers are particularly careful in grooming their offspring. If the coat is permeated by cold water, the pup can die of hypothermia. Mothers spend hours grooming, bonding, and just playing with their pups. Communicating with sharp barks and cries, mother and pup maintain contact with each other. Sea otters seldom come ashore. Anchored by kelp fronds, otters sleep fitfully, always wary of intruders. Several may raft together on these floating hotels of dense kelp fronds. Clever, fast, and curious by nature, sea otters are also equipped with razor-sharp teeth and grasping paws that enable them to capture or pry loose prey from the bottom. Some of the invertebrates that they eat have hard shells. Using rocks, they smash the shells while casually floating on their backs. For many people, the shoreline is the most familiar marine environment. But really, it is neither land nor sea, and life has to be resilient to survive in both worlds. The tidal zone borders all of the Point Lobos shoreline, and it extends out to underwater rocks that become exposed at low tides. Sea palms thrive in the aerated pounding surf. Like kelp, they are a form of brown algae and able to survive almost constant abuse by waves. Out of water, they endure hot sun and the drying effect of winds. But the coast has its calmer side too. Tide pools give us a window into miniature underwater worlds. Bright green sea lettuce carpets many rocks and is grazed by a number of invertebrates. Where conditions are right, colonies of mussels attach themselves to rocks and to each other and filter nutrients from the washing waves. Real estate is at a premium in the tidal zone, and a variety of colorful anemones and urchins compete for space. Shrimp and small fish are often trapped in tide pools as the tide recedes. Camouflage and the ability to fit in tight crevices is vital. Rockweed gunnels retreat to the protection of niches. Low tides reveal a variety of invertebrates and brilliantly colored encrusted sponges. Sea stars are common predators in these shallow habitats. crabs scavenge whatever they can. In turn, each predator is also prey, and often danger comes from the skies. Black oyster catchers survey the shore for small crabs, limpets, and other food. Gulls scavenge tide pools, beaches, and incoming tides for food in almost any form. Even resting seals are at risk. Western gulls mate in early spring. In a matter of weeks, hungry chicks demand to be fed. About 1/3 of the 200 species of birds observed at Point Lobos are birds of the sea and shore. Great egrets commonly hunt in shallow waters, and occasionally from perches atop dense mats of kelp. Much smaller, the snowy egret detects the slightest motion in tide pools and among exposed sea lettuce. Great blue herons thrive on the bounty of the shoreline. Turnstones and other small birds go after smaller prey and fill different niches than herons and other large shorebirds. While herons and many shorebirds are limited to shorelines and shallow waters, cormorants are professional divers and among the best fishers in the avian world. 2 species are found at Point Lobos, pelagic cormorants and Brandt's cormorants. Brandt's cormorants often fly in formation following the shoreline. Cormorants are equally at home on land, in the air, on water, and underwater. Widely spaced feathers become easily waterlogged, reducing the natural buoyancy of trapped air and allowing cormorants to pursue their prey. Feather care is all important, vital to cormorants, and they can often be found preening or drying out their feathers. If not dried, waterlogged feathers can cause hypothermia. Bird Island is a favorite nesting spot for Brandt's cormorants. The huge nesting colony draws thousands of birds in the late spring. Brandts prepare a rudimentary nest from kelp, seaweed, branches, and moss. They are not above borrowing materials from their neighbors. They are vocal, protective of their nest and immediate territory, but generally tolerant, even in tight quarters. But there are exceptions. Brutal fights sometimes occur between male suitors. Courtship rituals involve head bobbing, throat pouch displays, and raised tail feathers. Chicks are well cared for and almost always hungry. Pelagic cormorants nest in much smaller groups and sometimes find individual nesting spots on the side of cliffs. Above the high water mark, the plants of the coastal chaparral community cling to life in a harsh environment that is buffeted by wind, enveloped in salt spray, and bleached by the sun. Yet every spring, the plants of this habitat burst into brilliant displays of color and a dense profusion of life. The seemingly delicate flowers of sea pink belie the hardiness of the plant. Survival is aided by dew and the fogs of summer. Clusters of bright golden California poppies border the chaparral. But the most colorful spring show comes with the wild lilac bloom. This large shrub grows to tree size at Point Lobos and covers large areas with a color palette in varying shades of blue. One of the most common mammals is the California ground squirrel. Though they frequent rocky open areas, they are never too far from the protection of the thick interlocking shrubs and bushes of the chaparral. Small lizards bask in the sunlight between shrubs. Normally wary, black-tailed mule deer seem to sense the protection offered at Point Lobos. They forage in spring for delicate new leaves and flowers. The white-crowned sparrow is a common year-round resident, adaptable and able to survive on insects, plant blossoms, and seeds. The white-crowned sparrow also uses the dense foliage for protection. Scrub jays are bold, raucous, and inquisitive. Members of the crow family, they are among the most intelligent of birds and are equally at home in chaparral, meadows, or forests. When the sun sets, the animals of the night awaken. Mice scurry from shrub to shrub, emboldened by the protection of darkness. Above, owls hunt the night skies on silent wings. In late summer, dry stalks of dune buckwheat flowers stand out against the horizon. Many plants in the chaparral community are evergreens, but even after springtime, seasonal changes can be dramatic. With the shorter days of autumn, thickets of poison oak turn yellow, orange, and a brilliant red. Meadowlands comprise one of the rarest habitats at Point Lobos and along the central coast. The native grasses of the northern coastal prairie are protected in 3 meadow areas at Point Lobos. For years, ranching brought overgrazing. Along with the introduction of non-native grasses and fire control, natural prairies diminished in size. A whole ecosystem was threatened. Now, controlled fires are helping to re-establish the prairies. At Mound Meadow, the thick grasses provide an inviting habitat for deer. The edges of the meadow are feeding areas for coveys of California quail. Male Anna's hummingbirds choose open meadows to flash brilliant deep red throat markings in courtship. The feathers are not actually red, but like a prism, appear to change colors because of light refraction. Even without its wildlife, without its rugged natural beauty, Point Lobos would still be a very special place because of Monterey cypress. Old and weather-beaten, these trees are survivors, relics from another time and another climate. When California was first settled by Spanish colonists, the last Monterey cypress groves clung tenaciously to life on only a few acres of land, and in only 2 places in all of the world, across Carmel Bay on the Monterey Peninsula, and here at Point Lobos. Nearly surrounded by the sea and bathed in salt spray and summer fogs, the cypress finds enough water to survive naturally only at the tip of Point Lobos. Undoubtedly, the Monterey cypress was more widespread in the distant past, millions of years ago, but climates change over time, and the entire species retreated to the few remaining groves. The trees closest to wind-driven salt spray are partially covered in a cloak of bright orange. Ironically, it is a green algae. The algae and dangling lace lichens gather moisture from sea spray and fog, some of it eventually dripping down to tree roots. Few large shrubs survive in the dark understory below the cypress trees. Instead, grasses carpet the forest floor, and scattered about, Douglas iris. Juncos search for insects in the tree canopy and on the forest floor. Forests of Monterey pine cover much of Point Lobos. Though far more adaptable and widespread than Monterey cypress, Monterey pine was confined to the central coast when first encountered by the Spanish. Unlike the long-lived cypress, the fast-growing pines seldom live beyond 90 years. Fire is an important part of the life cycle of the Monterey pine, with its cones opening to seed after the heat of a fire. Branches serve as lookout platforms for hawks and other birds of prey. Trunk cavities in branches provide nests for small birds and even for great blue herons. Heron chicks grow rapidly, and competition at feeding time is fierce. October's skies bring monarch butterflies to the pine forests. Dense clusters of the wintering butterflies hang like drapes from some trees. On warm winter days, they search for nectar and reform clusters before the cool of evening sets in. Below, deer retreat to forest cover for protection. Bobcats live here, and mountain lions are occasional visitors to Point Lobos. After centuries of ranching and decades of the land being cleared for dairy farming, the pine forests are now returning to Point Lobos, and with them, a forest environment that includes an understory of shade-tolerant shrubs and mushrooms. A wide variety of mushrooms thrive in the cool, moist shade of the forest floor, where they help restore nutrients to the soil and decompose dead wood. The bright red sphere of the amanita may suddenly appear through the veil of pine needles and forest litter. Though the amanita is poisonous, many other mushrooms are edible. The Native American inhabitants of the Central Coast were skilled in living off the land and using mushrooms as food. People have been a part of this landscape for centuries, from Native Americans to Spanish settlers, and eventually to motion picture actors. Point Lobos has served as a backdrop for the human world, as well as the natural world. Many thousands of years ago, the first hunters and gatherers came to the Central Coast, yet they left little more than stone tools and charcoal from their fires in the archaeological record. Much later, possibly 3,000 years ago, people known as the Ohlone built a village near the northern boundary of the reserve at the mouth of San Jose Creek. Called Exchenta, the village of thatched huts was used seasonally by about 200 people during the spring and summer months. At Point Lobos, abalone shells eroding from charcoal-stained soil identify some of the 19 archaeological sites found on the reserve. The Ohlone hunted, fished, and gathered plants and seeds for food. stone metates were used to grind acorns and seeds into meal. When Spanish explorer Sebastian Vizcaino's ship sailed into Carmel Bay in 1602, the old ways and the life of the Ohlone would begin to change. Almost 170 years later, the Portola expedition of 1769 and 1770 camped beside San Jose Creek, north of Point Lobos. In 1771, a new mission at Carmel was established. Vaqueros, overseeing the herd of mission cattle, were probably the first Europeans to frequent Point Lobos. And at some time in this period, Point Lobos was named. After Mexico gained independence from Spain, Point Lobos became part of a large land grant in 1839. Then, as it is said, the plot thickens. The property was ceded, sold, traded, annexed, won and lost in card games, divided, subdivided, claimed, counterclaimed, litigated, and tied up in court until the year 1888. It finally took the signature of President Grover Cleveland to settle the paper chase. Within this time period, in the 1850s, the first permanent residents came to Point Lobos. Chinese immigrants followed their countrymen to America. But instead of working on the railroads or heading to the gold fields, it is believed they sailed their stout 30-foot junks across the Pacific and built what may have been the first Chinese fishing village in California. One of their dozen or so buildings remains to this day, Whaler's Cabin, overlooking Whaler's Cove. Ironically, in its century-and-a-half lifespan, Whaler's Cabin has been just about everything, except a whaler's cabin. Today, it serves as a museum. In 1862, Portuguese whalers from the Azores Islands came to Point Lobos and set up one of 16 whaling stations along the California coast. Their village of about 60 residents was located on the east side of Whalers Cove, at the edge of Carmelo Meadow. No structures remain from the whalers' village, but each spring, flamboyant red-hot poker plants still blossom. Non-native, they are living reminders of when Portuguese was the language spoken in this part of Point Lobos. A lookout at the top of Whaler's Knoll raised a flag, signaling to the whalers in the cove that a whale was sighted. Once harpooned, the whale was towed back to the whale oil processing plant, the Tri-Works. Beside the cove, a large granite quarry operated at what is now the Whalers Cove parking lot. Beginning in the 1850s, stone was cut and hauled from the outcrop to become a part of the San Francisco building boom. In the 1870s, Point Lobos became a shipping port for coal mined a few miles to the south. Coastal steamers pulled up to the deep waters of Coal Chute Point on the east side of the cove. Ore cars laden with coal ran on elevated tracks to pier pilings and the coal chute. By 1888, Point Lobos was owned by the Carmel Land and Coal Company. But in the late 1890s, high operating costs and a changing market forced the closure of the coal operation. The land was platted and subdivided into 1,000 city lots, the future site of Point Lobos City. It may have ended there if it were not for one man, Alexander Allen. A successful engineer and architect from Pennsylvania, he was struck by the beauty of Point Lobos and purchased all of the mining company's interest in Point Lobos. Bringing his wife Sadie and their family, they settled in a ranch house on the land in 1898. In an effort that would occupy his time for years to come, he tracked down ownership of the lots already sold and repurchased them one by one. Point Lobos was saved, and Point Lobos City would never exist except on paper. Long before most, A.M. Allen realized that this was a unique place, worthy of preservation for what it is, and not for what it could become. Shortly after his arrival at Point Lobos, Alexander Allen formed a business partnership with a marine biologist from Japan, Jinosuke Kodani. The business was abalone fishing and processing. Japanese abalone fishermen lived on the east side of Whalers Cove in a settlement now called Kodani Village. Abalone meat was dried on platforms leading out to Coal Chute Point. Virtually nothing remains of the small frame homes, except that, like in the Portuguese village, flowers still bloom in old gardens. A large cannery was built in the old quarry site. The business was successful. Even though there were several other abalone canneries, the Point Lobos cannery provided 75% of the abalone sold in California. Because of the frigid waters, the Japanese fishermen used diving gear to search ever deeper waters for abalone. The partnership and friendship between Alexander Allen and Jinosuke Kodani spanned 4 decades. It also spanned the Pacific. When A.M. Allen died, his life was honored here and in Japan as well. The Allen family sold 350 acres of the property to the state of California in 1933 for the creation of the reserve, and they gifted 15 acres of the rare cypress-covered point to the state, now known as the Allen Memorial Grove. During much of World War II, Point Lobos was off-limits, the site of gun emplacements and a secret radar installation. Whalers Cabin became a headquarters building. The beach at Whalers Cove was stormed in the training exercises of the 543rd Amphibious Brigade. Before and after the war, Point Lobos was a favorite location for Hollywood producers. It began in 1914 and continues in some form to this day. In 1919, an extravagant Monte Carlo-style set was built for the film Foolish Wives at Sea Lion Point. "10 years and many films later, an entire village set for the film Evangeline was burned. The fire also scarred the land for years to come. Stars came to Point Lobos: William Powell, Robert Mitchum, Greer Garson, Elizabeth Taylor, and Dustin Hoffman, among others. And James Cagney. The list of motion pictures using Point Lobos as a location hovers at about 50 films, including A Summer Place and Lassie Come Home. More importantly, Point Lobos is a place for people, an escape, and a place to discover. Artists and photographers have long felt the call of Point Lobos. Ansel Adams and Edward Weston found an idyllic, powerful landscape of sweeping panoramas. Edward Weston also found details, textures, and an intimate natural geometry in the rocks. Today, Point Lobos draws people from all around the world. They come to photograph in the footsteps of great photographers, to paint a different canvas, and to be a part of a timeless place. Here, life goes on, virtually undisturbed by our presence. Point Lobos State Reserve is a working example of what conservation can provide. Protected habitats for animals and the environment, and places for people as well.